The South China Sea is witnessing an escalating confrontation that could reshape energy security and maritime law across the Indo-Pacific. In contested waters northwest of Palawan, Philippine Coast Guard vessels are now directly blocking Chinese survey. Ships from exploring what may be Southeast Asia's most valuable untapped gas field. Reed Bank, located 85 nautical miles from the Philippine coast, sits at the center of this intensifying dispute. Beneath these waters lie an estimated 4 trillion cubic feet of in response to Chinese encroachment has evolved into an active defender of maritime sovereignty. Coast Guard vessels now position themselves directly between Chinese survey ships and their targets, forcing abandonment of exploration activities through sustained maritime interference. This transformation represents more than tactical evolution. It signals a broader shift in how smaller Southeast Asian nations are responding to Chinese maritime expansion and testing whether coordinated resistance can substitute for military deterrence in defending sovereign rights. The Philippines confronts an energy transition that makes Reed Bank development strategically essential rather than economically optional. Malampaya, which has supplied approximately 20% of national electricity generation since 2001, is experiencing accelerating production decline that threatens energy security within the current decade. Industry analysis indicates that Malampaya's commercially viable extraction will cease by 2030, creating an energy supply gap equivalent to the power needs of 4 million households. This timeline coincides with growing electricity demand from the country's expanding economy and population, amplifying the scale of the impending shortage. The economic implications extend beyond energy supply. The Philippines currently imports over 90% of its petroleum requirements, making the country vulnerable to global price volatility and supply disruptions. Energy import costs have increased by 40% over the past 2 years, contributing to inflation and reducing manufacturing competitiveness against regional competitors. Reed Bank offers the most viable solution to this crisis. Geological surveys indicate reserves sufficient to meet national gas requirements for 2 to 3 decades, with the additional advantage of proximity to existing pipeline infrastructure that could enable relatively rapid development. Conservative estimates suggest Reed Bank development could reduce electricity generation costs by 20 to 30% compared to imported liquefied natural gas, providing substantial relief to consumers while generating significant government revenues through production sharing agreements. However, energy development in contested waters requires security guarantees that major international energy companies have been reluctant to provide given the risk of Chinese interference and potential asset seizure. But the energy security challenge is only part of the larger strategic picture unfolding in these waters. China's approach to Reed Bank reflects its broader South China Sea strategy of establishing operational control through persistent presence while avoiding direct territorial annexation that could trigger military responses from the United States and regional allies. The methodology follows a consistent pattern across the region. State-owned energy companies, particularly China National Offshore Oil Corporation, deploy sophisticated survey vessels to conduct detailed resource mapping under the classification of marine scientific research. These operations provide the technical foundation for future extraction activities while maintaining plausible deniability about commercial objectives. Chinese survey activities around Reed Bank intensified dramatically between 2019 and 2021. The survey vessel Haiyang DG-8 conducted multiple extended operations directly over the gas field, using advanced seismic equipment to map subsurface geology and hydrocarbon deposits with remarkable precision. These operations occur within a comprehensive security framework. China Coast Guard vessels escort survey ships while maritime militia forces, fishing vessels equipped with satellite communications and often manned by personnel with military training, maintain persistent area presence. This layered approach creates an operational environment that discourages interference while providing escalation options if challenged. The broader context involves China's transformation of the South China Sea through militarized artificial island construction. 7 major installations across the Spratly Islands provide radar coverage, airfield access, and missile deployment sites that effectively project Chinese military power across the entire region. This infrastructure creates what defense analysts describe as an anti-access environment that complicates external military intervention while providing China with escalation dominance in any regional crisis involving maritime disputes. The systematic nature of Chinese operations suggests long-term strategic planning rather than opportunistic resource extraction, indicating that Reed Bank represents one component of a comprehensive regional control strategy. However, this calculated expansion has generated an equally systematic response. The Philippine Coast Guard's evolution from domestic law enforcement agency to frontline defender of maritime sovereignty represents one of the most significant developments in regional security architecture. This transformation reflects both institutional modernization and strategic reorientation toward great power competition. Organizational changes have been substantial and purposeful. Fleet expansion through partnerships with Japan, South Korea, and the United States has provided larger, more capable vessels with extended patrol range and sophisticated communication systems. The flagship vessel BRP Gabriela Silang, acquired from Japan, can conduct extended operations in contested waters while maintaining secure communications with headquarters. Training programs now emphasize international maritime law, crisis de-escalation techniques, and precision maneuvering in close-quarters situations. Coast Guard personnel receive specialized instruction in these high-stakes operations where a single miscalculation could trigger broader escalation. The tactical doctrine has evolved to emphasize persistent presence and direct interference with Chinese activities. Coast Guard vessels conduct regular sovereignty patrols around Reed Bank, maintaining visible Philippine presence in areas where Chinese forces previously operated without challenge. The operational approach involves positioning Philippine vessels between Chinese survey ships and their targets, requiring precise navigation to maintain interference without creating collision risks. This technique, known as interposition, demands exceptional seamanship and communication skills to execute safely in potentially hostile environments. Recent confrontations demonstrate both the effectiveness and risks of this strategy. In March 2021, Coast Guard vessel BRP Malampaya forced Chinese survey ship Haiyang DG-8 to abandon seismic operations around Reed Bank after a 72-hour standoff that attracted international attention and diplomatic pressure. Similar incidents have occurred around other contested features, establishing a pattern of Philippine resistance that represents a fundamental shift in regional maritime dynamics. Coast Guard crews now operate routinely in situations where they are outnumbered by ratios exceeding 10-to-1. Hundreds of miles from friendly support, surrounded by potentially hostile forces. And this tactical evolution occurs within a broader legal framework that provides both justification and constraints for Philippine actions. The 2016 Arbitral Tribunal ruling provides the legal foundation for Philippine resistance to Chinese activities while establishing principles that extend far beyond bilateral disputes. The Permanent Court of Arbitration's decision fundamentally undermined China's 9-line claims and confirmed Philippine sovereign rights under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The tribunal's findings were comprehensive and unambiguous. China's historical claims lack basis in international maritime law. Maritime zones are determined by coastal geography rather than historical maps. Artificial islands cannot generate territorial waters or exclusive economic zones. Most critically for Reed Bank, the area falls entirely within the Philippines' 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. However, the ruling highlighted the fundamental tension between international law and geopolitical reality. China rejected the decision before it was announced and continues, operating in contested waters as if the tribunal's findings have no binding effect. This creates a situation where legal legitimacy exists without enforcement mechanisms. The Philippines has leveraged the ruling diplomatically, citing it in bilateral discussions and multilateral forums to build international support. The United States, Japan, Australia, and European Union nations have explicitly endorsed the tribunal's decision and criticized Chinese non-compliance. But diplomatic support has practical limits in the absence of enforcement capabilities. The real value of the legal victory depends on the Philippines' ability to defend its maritime rights through direct action rather than relying solely on international pressure. The arbitration ruling also established precedents that apply to similar disputes throughout the region, making Reed Bank a test case for international maritime law in contested waters. This legal framework intersects with broader regional security dynamics that extend beyond bilateral relations. The Reed Bank confrontation occurs within evolving maritime security dynamics across Southeast Asia, where multiple nations face similar pressures from Chinese expansion while developing coordinated responses that balance resistance with stability. Vietnam confronts analogous challenges around the Paracel Islands, where Chinese forces maintain permanent installations despite Vietnamese territorial claims. The 2019 incident involving Chinese survey vessel Haiyang DG-8 operating in Vietnamese waters with Coast Guard escort demonstrated the regional scope of Chinese resource exploration activities. In June 2019, a Chinese fishing vessel struck and sank a Philippine fishing boat near Reed Bank, leaving 22 Filipino fishermen in the water. The Chinese crew departed without conducting rescue operations, creating a diplomatic crisis that highlighted the human cost of maritime tensions. This incident galvanized Philippine public opinion and strengthened support for more assertive Coast Guard operations. Malaysian and Bruneian offshore energy projects face periodic interference from Chinese survey vessels operating within their exclusive economic zones, while Indonesia has increased naval patrols around the Natuna Islands, following repeated incursions by Chinese fishing fleets escorted by Coast Guard vessels. The Philippine Coast Guard's tactical innovations are being studied and potentially adapted by other regional maritime forces. Vietnam's Coast Guard has adopted similar persistent presence strategies, while Malaysia has modernized its maritime enforcement capabilities with apparent focus on contested area operations. This pattern suggests that Chinese expansion is generating coordinated resistance rather than individual accommodation. However, the sustainability of such resistance depends on continued political will, external support, and the ability to manage escalation risks. The United States and allied nations have responded with increased naval presence and capacity-building assistance. Freedom of navigation operations by American, Australian, British, and French naval forces demonstrate international opposition to excessive maritime claims while providing implicit security guarantees. But the immediate tactical burden of defending maritime rights falls primarily on regional Coast Guard forces operating in increasingly dangerous conditions. The broader implications of South China Sea disputes encompass global trade, flows, and supply chain security that extend far beyond regional energy resources. Approximately 3.4 trillion in annual trade transits these waters, representing nearly one-third of global maritime commerce, including energy shipments from the Middle East, manufactured goods from East Asian factories, and agricultural products feeding hundreds of millions of people. Control over these shipping lanes provides leverage over the economies of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and much of Southeast Asia. This geo-economic dimension explains why the United States treats potential Chinese dominance over South China Sea transit routes as an unacceptable strategic threat requiring sustained military and diplomatic response. For the Philippines specifically, Reed Bank development could provide transformative economic benefits while reducing strategic vulnerability. Energy security concerns create powerful domestic political incentives for assertive maritime policies regardless of Chinese opposition or escalation risks. Rising import costs and currency pressure from energy dependence threaten economic stability and social cohesion. Domestic gas production could provide fiscal relief while reducing vulnerability to external price volatility and supply disruptions. International energy companies remain cautious about major investments in contested areas due to security concerns and potential asset seizure risks. The Philippine Coast Guard's success in deterring Chinese interference could improve the investment climate, but sustained security guarantees are required for the multi-billion-dollar commitments necessary for offshore development. The strategic competition dimension involves testing whether international law and coordinated resistance can constrain great power expansion in maritime domains. The Reed Bank outcome will likely influence Chinese behavior in other contested areas and affect broader perceptions of international legal institutions' relevance. However, the situation becomes more complicated when considering the escalation dynamics and potential consequences of sustained confrontation. The Reed Bank confrontation will likely intensify rather than resolve through diplomatic accommodation, as both sides have defined their positions in terms that make compromise difficult without significant credibility and strategic costs. For China, acknowledging Philippine control over Reed Bank would undermine the broader Nine-Line claim and potentially encourage similar resistance from other regional nations. The precedent of successful opposition to Chinese resource extraction could spread across the South China Sea, complicating long-term regional strategy. For the Philippines, retreat from Reed Bank would effectively surrender the country's most important energy prospect while demonstrating inability to defend sovereign rights within its own exclusive economic zone. Such development could trigger domestic political consequences while encouraging further Chinese expansion. The tactical dynamics favor continued escalation through gray zone activities rather than direct military confrontation. Both sides will likely expand maritime law enforcement capabilities while developing new techniques for interference and counter-interference operations. External factors will significantly influence the trajectory. Sustained U.S. and allied support for Philippine maritime rights could encourage continued resistance, while reduced international attention might enable Chinese pressure to achieve gradual accommodation. The energy dimension adds urgency to Philippine decision-making as Malampaya depletion approaches. The window for reed bank development is narrowing, creating incentives for more aggressive action to secure access regardless of Chinese opposition. Regional precedent effects mean that the reed bank outcome will influence similar disputes across Southeast Asia. Success in defending maritime rights could encourage broader resistance to Chinese expansion, while failure might signal inevitable accommodation to Chinese regional dominance. The battle for reed bank represents a defining test of international order in the Indo-Pacific region, with implications that extend far beyond bilateral energy disputes to fundamental questions about sovereignty, international law, and great power competition in the 21st century. The Philippines' strategy combines legal legitimacy with tactical innovation and international support to challenge a far superior adversary through asymmetric methods that avoid direct military confrontation while asserting sovereign rights. This approach's success or failure will likely influence how other middle powers respond to similar challenges from rising authoritarian states. The confrontation tests whether persistent resistance by smaller nations, supported by international legal frameworks and allied backing, can substitute for traditional military deterrence in constraining territorial expansion. The outcome will demonstrate whether coordinated opposition can effectively challenge great power ambitions or whether superior military and economic capabilities ultimately determine maritime control. The broader implications encompass alliance credibility, international law effectiveness, and the future balance of power across the Indo-Pacific. Reed Bank has become a symbol of resistance to authoritarian expansion and a practical test of principles that underpin the international system established after World War II. The daily reality involves Philippine Coast Guard vessels maintaining patrols in contested waters, while Chinese forces probe for tactical advantages and both sides prepare for extended competition over critical energy resources. Each confrontation contributes to precedents that will influence maritime behavior and international relations for decades. Reed Bank represents more than an energy resource or territorial dispute. It embodies fundamental questions about whether sovereign rights deserve protection, whether international law can constrain great power ambitions, and whether smaller nations can successfully defend their interests against superior adversaries through strategy, law, and international cooperation. The outcome will help determine whether the Indo-Pacific evolves toward Chinese hegemony or maintains a balance that preserves sovereignty, economic opportunity, and strategic autonomy for all regional nations. The stakes could not be higher, and the battle continues daily in the contested waters where Philippine and Chinese forces define the future of maritime order in one of the world's most strategically important regions. For comprehensive analysis of Indo-Pacific geopolitics and maritime security developments, subscribe to our channel and share this content with others seeking to understand the strategic forces shaping international relations in the 21st century.